Hello everyone and welcome again to another recorded lecture of AP1, and today we'll discuss an overview of the musculoskeletal system, which comprises chapters 8 through 11. So this is going to be the most in-depth investigation of the muscular system and the skeletal system, and I'm going to focus mostly on how these two organ systems interact with each other. And this is where a lot of the details come in about skeletal attachments and actions at particular joints. So this is quite a lot of memorization. I've tried my best to focus on the important info, and I've made an important table that's in the practical review guide that'll be very, very, very helpful when you're studying for the practical. So you have a lot of resources. In addition to the textbook and the lab manual, I highly recommend using 3D Human. That's the app you have. There's also a really good website called Get Body Smart. And for each group of muscles, you can click on it and then it will tell you all the different muscles. They'll show you where they're attached. Sometimes they'll even give you animations of the skeleton moving with the muscle. So again, for each type of muscle, and it shows you the action. So I really like this because sometimes it's hard to imagine what these actions really do. So let's take the example of the obliques. The external oblique muscle we know flexes the vertebral column, right? It basically brings us over downward. And this animation shows you what that means. Right, the obliques also help us rotate the torso. So again, by clicking play, you can see what that action really means. So this helps you understand a lot of the movement terms we spoke about, right? Like flexion, extension, pronation, supination, etc. But it also gives you a lot of important information about the muscle itself and which parts of the skeleton it interacts with. There's two other apps or websites that I really like. Yoga Anatomy is one, and KindMan is another. And these allow you to manipulate skeletons and look at different positions of muscles and skeletons. So these are really good resources. I think you should look at all of them. And as we move forward, so right now, please take out your phone or an iPad or something with 3D Human, because as I go along in this lecture, I'm going to ask you to follow along with your app. And before I go into the lecture, I want to just mention two upcoming tests. So exam 3, we'll cover chapters 7 through 11. That's a big exam. It's a lot of information. So all of bone, tissue, the skeletal system, muscular system, and joints. So this is going to be mostly multiple choice, fill in the blank, and matching. This is on April 14th at 12:30 on Connect. So it's not going to be a lot of labeling at all. It's going to be multiple choice. So a lot of the content behind chapters 7 through 11. And I won't focus, just as a hint, I won't focus so much on this lecture. So whatever's contained in here will mostly be on the practical. I'll say that again. So the practical 3, which is the musculoskeletal system, that's labeling muscles, skeletal attachment, and actions. That's what I'm going to talk about today. So that's on April 16th at 12:30. That's going to be more about labeling the muscles and understanding everything on that table. So for exam 3, again, focus more on the content, multiple choice stuff, and then practical 3 is going to be labeling skeletal attachments and actions. So I wanted to take a step back and show you some slides that I showed you earlier, because now we have to understand some of these anatomical features of bone a little more in depth. So this is a good reference. I'm not going to repeat everything, but this is a good reference of different types of features on bone and how to describe them. So for example, a tuberosity is a bump on a bone that helps muscle attach to it. So this is the humerus, and we'll discuss which muscles attach to this tuberosity. Here's some other ones, some spines. You could see spines, crests, a process is a protrusion. And again, all of these features are for skeletal or for muscle attachment to the skeleton. So here is this table I made for you. This should be your go-to starting point for studying for the practical. So for each muscle, I want you to know the proximal attachment, or the origin, the distal attachment, or the insertion, and a sample action. And for those muscles that act on a joint, I want you to know these specific joints. So what I did was I combined all the essential info, and I kind of made it easier for you. So a lot of this is less detailed than the book, and it's not 100%. I mean, I kind of summarized a little bit, but this is the bare minimum of what you should know. So these are the 2 pages to this chart. So after you study, you should be able to fill out a blank chart like this. So it's imperative that you study very hard before exam 3 and before the practical. Okay, so let's get started. So let's start with our friend, the SCM, the Sternocleidomastoid. And what we spoke about, the SCM, it rotates and it helps flex the neck, like left or right. So it rotates left or right, or flexes the neck down. So everyone rotate your neck. And that's moving at the pivot diarthrosis called the atlantoaxial joint. That's where the rotation takes place. And this is the muscle, the SCM. And it originates, where it originates is the clavicle. That's where the cleido part means. And the sterno part refers to the manubrium. So the manubrium of the sternum and the medial third of the clavicle, so this is the clavicle over here, is where the proximal attachment is. The distal attachment, or the insertion, is the mastoid process. And that's part of the temporal bone, the mastoid process. So I'll show you a picture of the mastoid process. So this is the temporal bone over here. So the mastoid process is a protuberance of the temporal bone behind the ear. And again, that's what's shown up here, where the SCM inserts. And here is that joint, the atlantoaxial joint, which is a pivot diarthrosis between the atlas, which is C1, and the axis, which is C2. And again, this allows for rotation at the atlantoaxial joint. So now look on your 3D human, and you should be able to manipulate specifically. So let me go right now to 3D biohuman. And here's the musculoskeletal system. So there's a few things that you can do. You can search. So if I type in sterno, I wonder if this will come up already. So you could help highlight it. You could search for whatever muscle you're looking for, and then it will allow you to look and click on it. So this is all the muscles of the neck, and now you're looking at the SCM. And of course, we might need to get rid of our trapezius. Oh, sorry, our platysma. That's not the trapezius. Get rid of the platysma in order to see the SCM. And it's easy to see here the attachments to the manubrium of the sternum, as well as the medial third of this clavicle. And then if you turn around, you can see the mastoid process is the origin. Oh, sorry, the insertion. So it inserts on the mastoid process. So as I'm going through each muscle, you should make sure that you're following along with the app or with the website, because it's very important to visualize where these muscles attach. So a couple of muscles we'll discuss next attach to the scapula, right? The shoulder bone. So there are a couple of important landmarks we should be familiar with. The coracoid process. The coracoid process is like a finger-like projection. And we'll see that muscles like the biceps help attach. This attaches the bicep. You have this, this is not the best. I'll show you the acromion in the next slide. It's a bit of a better picture. But this is the anterior view. So if you're looking at somebody from the front, this is the right scapula. This is the right scapula, an anterior view. And that means that this would be the medial border, and this is the lateral border, right? This is facing away from the midline. This is closer to the midline. And then if I were to flip this around, like turn this around, I would see the posterior view. And that's what you're looking at right here, is the right posterior view of the scapula. And there you can see the acromion is sticking out like the shoulder blade. Right, that's the shoulder blade. And then we have what's called the spine. The spine, that's in the posterior part of the scapula. And then again, here's just one more, here's that spine, that scapular spine that I'll talk about in just a bit. So now let's talk about the next muscle, the trapezius. The trapezius. And we know that among the actions of the trapezius, it helps extend the neck. So after the SCM flexes our neck downward, the trapezius can help extend it back up. And it also helps adduct the scapula. Remember, adduct means to bring back, right? So to bring back together. So after you abduct your shoulders, you put them apart, you adduct them back, you bring them back together. And the trapezius originates along the cervical, the neck, and the thoracic vertebrae. So there's a very, very large attachment site shown in red here. And it also attaches on the occipital bone itself. So the trapezius originates at the occipital bone and all along the cervical and thoracic vertebrae. It's a very large muscle. And it inserts on the clavicle in front in the anterior portion. And then in the back, it attaches to the spine and the acromion of the scapula. So here is the spine. This is the acromion. And you can see over here, this is our trapezius muscle. You can see how it attaches to the occipital bone, goes all the way down the vertebrae, and it also attaches to the spine and acromion of the scapula. So sticking with the scapula, we have a muscle called the levator scapulae, which elevates the scapula. And it originates on the cervical vertebrae, specifically the transverse processes. So those are the parts that stick out on the sides. So it attaches to C1 through C4. And it it inserts on the scapula at the medial margin. So here's the medial margin. Remember, this is the lateral margin. This is the medial margin. So we have the scapula and the cervical vertebrae 1 through 4 are the skeletal attachments of the levator scapulae. And again, this is going to elevate the scapula. It's going to raise our shoulders. After we elevate our scapula, we might have to depress it, bring it back down. And the muscle that does that is the pectoralis minor. The pectoralis minor. And it originates on the anterior ribs 1 through 3. 3 through 5. Anterior ribs 3, 4, and 5 are where the pectoralis minor originates. Right, so that's the proximal attachment. The distal attachment is the coracoid process of the scapula. Remember, the coracoid process is that little finger-like projection in the front. So the pectoralis minor attaches to the scapula and the anterior ribs 3 through 5, and they depress the scapula after the levator scapulae elevates it. So now let's talk about the next joint called the glenohumeral joint, aka the shoulder. And this is a ball and socket diarthrosis between the scapula, this is the scapula, and the humerus. And this helps move our upper limbs by flexion and extension. So you can bring your whole upper arm in front of you, or you could bring it back. That's the shoulder joint. Everyone touch your shoulder and put your arm right out in front of you. You can feel your shoulder moving, right? So that's flexion and extension. Also rotation. So feel your shoulder as you rotate your upper arm, as you rotate your humerus. It also helps abduction and adduction. So everyone move your humerus away from your body. That's abducting. And you can feel your shoulder moving. And then adduct it back. Bring it back towards your body. So I want to point your attention to the glenoid cavity, which is a part of the scapula. This is the glenoid cavity, right? And remember, the acromion is another attachment site. Right? The acromion is in the back and the coracoid process is in the front. So here's that coracoid process, and then here's the glenoid cavity. So far, so good. So now let's talk about some muscles of the back and torso. So Pectoralis major, the Pectoralis major does a lot of actions on the humerus as well. So it flexes, it adducts, and medially rotates the humerus, right? And again, this is at that shoulder joint we just spoke about. We just mentioned all these actions, right? Flexion, adduction, and rotation at the shoulder joint. The muscle that allows for these actions is the pectoralis major, or the pecs. And the pecs originate at the clavicle, as well as the sternum, and it also attaches to the costal cartilage. And where it inserts is a specific location on the humerus. There's actually two specific locations called the greater tubercle and also the intertubercular sulcus. The intertubercular sulcus. So that's where the pectoralis major inserts. And that's the distal attachment. So I want to show you those two parts where the pectoralis major attaches to. The greater tubercle and the intertubercular sulcus. So this is where the pecs insert. So moving on, we have the Latissimus dorsi. The Latissimus dorsi. So make sure you're looking at the Latissimus dorsi on your app. And our latissimus also helps our humerus move around. So it helps us adduct, extend, and medially rotate the humerus. And again, so adduction, extension, and rotation of the humerus is still, we're working on that glenohumeral joint. So it's such a huge muscle, there's a lot of skeletal attachments for the lats. So the lats start by originating in the inferior thoracic, so the lower part of the thorax, and the lumbar vertebrae. And it goes all the way down into the sacrum. It also attaches to the iliac crest of the pelvis and the lower 3 or 4 ribs. So it has a lot of attachments. It's a very large muscle. It inserts also at the intertubercular sulcus. So just like we saw over here with the pectoralis major at the intertubercular sulcus, the lats also insert there. So this is a good one to look at up close and to make sure you notice all these different skeletal attachments. So let's move to the upper limb. And we have the deltoid muscle that acts, it's right by the glenohumeral joint, by the shoulder. And this will help us abduct, flex, and extend the humerus. And again, let's do this. Let's feel our shoulder. Let's abduct, flex, and extend the humerus. The deltoid is helping you do all of these things. The deltoid is right here. It originates at the clavicle and the scapula. Right, so that's up here. The scapula, specifically the acromion, which is this part over here, and the spine and the clavicle. And then it inserts on the humerus. So the deltoid inserts all the way down on the humerus, specifically at a location called the deltoid tuberosity. So that makes sense. The deltoid tuberosity is where the deltoid attaches to on the humerus. So here is that deltoid tuberosity. And that's what I mentioned before when I showed you this picture in like the first or second slide. So the deltoid tuberosity, and then you could test yourself. What attaches at the intertubercular sulcus? All right, we said the pectoralis major does. Also the lats do. So rectus abdominis. So here are the rectus abdominis muscles, or the abs. And this helps flex the vertebral column. And it originates at the pubis, all the way down here. So specifically, it attaches to the pubic crest. This is the little crest, this little protrusion, the pubic crest. And it also inserts at the costal cartilage and the xiphoid process. So you can see the rectus abdominis attaches to some of the costal cartilage of the ribs as well as the xiphoid process. So it's a very long muscle. Right, it goes from the pubic crest out to the xiphoid process and helps us flex the vertebral column. So let's move on to the muscles of the upper limb, most notably the biceps brachii. So the biceps brachii. And these help flex the forearm, like in a bicep curl, and also help supinate the forearm. And this helps flex the forearm at the elbow, which has two joints, the humeroulnar and the humeroradial joint. That's the elbow joint. And that's a hinge diarthrosis, right, at the elbow. And the biceps brachii originates at the scapula on the coracoid process. This coracoid process. There's also a small protrusion called the supraglenoid tubercle that also is an attachment site for the biceps. And it inserts all the way down on the radius, on the radial tuberosity. So the biceps originate up here at the scapula. They insert on the radius, and they can help flex the forearm at the elbow joint. So again, make sure you can look at the attachments on your app to make sure you understand how these muscles can move based on where they're attached. And then here's the coracoid process and the supraglenoid tubercle, where the biceps originate. And here is the radial tuberosity, where the radial tuberosity is where the biceps insert. So here we have an up-close view of the humeroradial joint and the humerulnar joint, which make up the elbow. So the elbow joints are hinge diarthroses, right? They help for flexion and extension. Right, so the humeroradial joint is between the radius and the humerus, and the humerulnar joint is between the ulna and the humerus. So the triceps brachii antagonizes the biceps because it helps extend our forearm at the elbow joint. And the triceps has 3 different attachments. You don't really have to know all 3 specific attachments because it has 3 heads. What I want you to know that it originates on the humerus. It originates on the humerus. And it also has a slight attachment to the scapula as well, at a place called the infraglenoid tubercle. The infraglenoid tubercle. Remember, infra means beneath, the glenoid, that cavity of the shoulder, right? Tubercle, a bump. And it inserts on the ulna, at the olecranon, or the elbow. So the triceps insert at the elbow. And again, this is helping us extend our forearm. So this is the olecranon. Here's the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, where the triceps attach to. And again, try to visualize this. Like, what are the triceps trying to do? Right? How does it make sense that it attached to the scapula and olecranon? Like, how would it be able to extend based on how it's attached? That's what I want you to try to think about. Okay, so now let's move down to muscles of the lower limb. And we'll start with a group of muscles called the hamstrings. So the posterior lower limb are the hamstrings. They consist of the biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus muscles. And they all originate on the femur and the pelvis. So this is the ischial tuberosity of the pelvis. And it inserts all the way down on the fibula and the tibia. So overall, the hamstrings start at the ischial tuberosity of the pelvis, and they go all the way down to the knee, where the fibula and tibia are. And it helps flex the lower leg at the knee. Right? So the hamstrings help us flex our lower leg, so bring our lower leg back, right, at the hinge diarthrosis. So that's what the hamstrings are doing. And again, each muscle of the hamstrings has a different insertion technically, but overall you can remember that they insert on the fibula and tibia, and they originate at the pelvis. So here is that ischial tuberosity where the hamstrings attach to. So moving into the anterior direction, we'll look at the quadriceps, which are 4 muscles of the thigh that include the rectus femoris, vastus, lateralis, intermedius, and medialis. And we can see over here that they all originate at the femur and the pelvis. Femur over here, and the pelvis over here. And they insert at the quadriceps tendon all the way down to the patella. To the patella. So the tibial tuberosity is the end point of the insertion for the quadriceps. So there's this really large tendon called a quadriceps tendon. And so it extends all the way from here to the patella. So it's a very, very powerful group of muscles, the most powerful group of muscles in the body. And again, this is going to extend the lower leg. So after you flex your lower leg with your hamstrings, you're going to bring it back with your quadriceps. And this acts at the knee. So I just want to show you, this is the quadriceps, and notice how this is the insertion at the patellar tendon all the way to the patella and the patellar tendon. This is where the quadriceps insert. And the final ending, like the final insertion, the most distal attachment, is called the tibial tuberosity, which is a part of the tibia. All right, so that's the most distal attachment of the quadriceps group of muscles. So still staying with the lower limb, let's talk about the gastrocnemius. The gastrocnemius, which helps us with plantar flexion. So when you point your feet, plantar flexion is again done by the gastrocnemius, at the ankle joint. At the ankle joint. This is another example of a hinge diarthrosis. It's called the talocrural joint. And again, plantar flexion at the ankle is done by the gastrocnemius, and it originates at the femur. These are two condyles. Those two bumps of the femur is where the gastrocnemius attaches. And it goes all the way down to the heel and attaches to the calcaneus, the heel bone, via calcaneal tendons. So there's a special tendon shown here. This is called the calcaneal tendon. And that's what brings the gastrocnemius to insert on the calcaneus. So this is the femur, and this is showing you those condyles, and this is showing you the calcaneus. And this is the heel joint. So let's quickly talk about mastication muscles. So to chew, I want you to understand that the masseter is going to help us chew our food, and so it elevates the mandible. It brings our mandible up. And it does this at a special joint called the TMJ, or the temporomandibular joint. And I'll talk about this. I'm going to go back and forth from this slide. So the joint of the mandible is the temporomandibular joint, which is like a combination of a hinge diarthrosis, because it goes up and down like a hinge, like open, close, but also a gliding, because we need this gliding motion as we chew. And the masseter originates at the zygomatic arch, and it inserts at the mandible. So this is the origin, this is the zygomatic arch, and it inserts on the mandible at the lateral surface and the ramus. The lateral surface and the ramus of the mandible. So overall, the masseter will help us elevate the mandible to help us chew at the temporomandibular joint. So here is that temporomandibular joint, here is the masseter muscle, and here is the mandible. And that marks the end of the muscles for the practical. So again, you must be familiar with the origins, insertions, and actions of all the muscles in that table that started the show. For all the muscles with an associated joint listed, you must be able to name the joint, describe the type of joint, and explain the type of movement the joint allows. So make sure you look at the chart. There's 33 muscles. The ones that are in bold, you may be asked to indicate the actions and attachments. So you have to be able to label any of the muscles on the chart on a 3D model on Connect. For the ones in bold, you have to, like those included in the slideshow, you have to know the actions and skeletal attachments. So that is it for this. So you have all the information you need for exam 3 and practical 3. And this marks the end of the musculoskeletal system. So study hard, make sure you use all the resources available to you. Get very acquainted with the 3D digital app, because it'll be the closest thing to the Connect exam. Like when you see a practical, you're going to see that 3D human again, and it'll be really easy for you if you just practice every day. Do a little bit of practice, go through all the muscles, and test yourself. And again, I'll always suggest studying with a group if possible. Make a study group, come up with an online Google Hangout maybe, and test yourself until you know it fluently. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time when we start discussing the nervous system.